The salt-laced wind that scoured the docks of Port Blossom had a particular cruelty to it that autumn, a scouring, insistent chill that promised a winter of bitter reckoning. For Alara, who at 17 had come to measure her life in the increments between one cold and the next, it was a physical threat. It found the thin spots in her worn coat, the gaps in her resolve, and whispered of an ending she felt gaining on her with every sunset. She was an island in a town built on the shores of a greater one, a ghost haunting the periphery of a community that had already written her off, filed her away under the sad, brief heading of The Fisherman's Girl. A story that had concluded the day her father's boat, the Tern, was found splintered against the southern breakwater, its captain claimed by the sea that had given him his living. Homelessness was not a sudden fall for her, but a slow, grinding erosion, like a sandstone cliff giving way to the ceaseless tide. First the house, then the charity of neighbors, then the patience of the church, until all that was left was the wind and the cold cobblestones, and the hollow ache in her stomach that was part hunger, part grief. She had $20 to her name. A single folded bill kept in the waterproof pouch her father had given her, a relic from a life that felt as distant as a foreign country. It was her last tether to a world of commerce and choices, a world where one could purchase warmth or a meal. Now it was a weight, a burden of decision. It could buy her a bus ticket to a city where she might find a different kind of cold, a more anonymous misery. It could buy her a few days of hot food from the greasy spoon by the cannery, a temporary truce with the gnawing emptiness inside her. But Alara knew, with the hard-won clarity of the truly desperate, that such solutions were merely postponements. The bus would arrive, the food would be eaten, and she would be back where she started, only with empty pockets and a spirit worn even thinner. She needed something that would last. She needed an anchor, not a sail. Her search for this anchor led her, as it always did, to the boneyard at the edge of the harbor. It was a place of endings, where the sea's broken toys were left to surrender to rust and time. Here lay the skeletal remains of trawlers, the splintered hulls of dinghies, the ghosts of vessels whose names had been worn away by sun and salt. It was a place the townsfolk avoided, a testament to failure and loss in a town that prided itself on its resilience. But for Alara, it was a library of stories, each corroded bolt and patch of peeling paint a word in a language she understood. Her father had taught her this language, the grammar of the sea and the ships that challenged it. He had taught her that every boat had a soul, a character forged in the way it met a wave or held a course. He had also taught her that the most important part of a boat wasn't its mast or its engine, but its belly, the hull, the part that knew the water most intimately. And there it was, the sea serpent. It was less a boat and more a monument to decay, a hulking rusted carcass beached high on the muddy flats, listing at an angle that seemed final. It had been there for years, a local joke, a landmark of dereliction. Its deck was a patchwork of rot and rust, its wheelhouse windows shattered like vacant eyes. The deep, angry orange of corrosion had bled down its sides in long streaks, like weeping wounds. The town council had been trying to get rid of it for a decade, but the cost of hauling and scrapping the tons of steel was more than the frugal town leadership was willing to spend. It was a problem no one wanted, a thing so worthless it had become a permanent fixture. The other fishermen, mending their nets nearby, saw her looking. One of them, a man named Jed, whose face was a road map of sun and suspicion, called out, a smirk playing on his lips. "What are you looking at, girl? Admiring the flagship of the Port Blossom fleet?" His friends chuckled, the sound as rough as barnacles. She ignored them, her gaze fixed on the derelict. The laughter was just another part of the wind, a sound she had learned to let pass through her. She was not looking at the rust, or the rot, or the shattered glass. She was looking at its shape. She was looking at the deep, almost exaggerated curve of its hull, the way it was built not for speed but for stability, a deep-bellied beast designed to carry heavy loads through heavy seas. It had been a bottom dragger, a workhorse meant to haul tons of fish and ice from the depths. Its strength was in its belly. An idea, faint and fragile as a spider's thread, began to form in the quietest corner of her mind. It was an insane idea, a notion born of the absolute absence of better options. It was a whisper against the roaring wind of her reality. She walked, not to the fisherman, but to the small clapboard building that served as the town hall and harbormaster's office. Inside, behind a mountain of ledgers and charts, sat Mr. Silas Croft. He was a man who seemed to have been carved from petrified wood, all hard angles and splinters. He was a town councilman, a landlord, and the primary force behind the town's rigid adherence to propriety and profit. He owned the land adjacent to the boat boneyard and considered the Sea Serpent a personal affront to his waterfront development ambitions. He looked up as she entered, his eyes, small and dark like currants, narrowing with immediate disapproval. "What is it?" he asked, his voice the dry rustle of old paper. Ilara's own voice felt foreign in her throat, thin and unused. "I want to buy the old boat," she said, gesturing vaguely toward the harbor. "The rusted one." Croft stared at her as if she had sprouted a second head. "The Sea Serpent?" He let out a short, incredulous bark of a laugh. "That piece of scrap? Child, that thing is a liability, not an asset. It would cost you $10,000 just to make it float, and another 20 to make it safe." "I don't want it to float," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of confidence. "I just want to buy it." Croft's amusement curdled into suspicion. He leaned forward, his chair groaning in protest. "What for? You planning on starting a tetanus farm?" "The town owns it. Or rather, the town is burdened by it. We've been trying to pay someone to haul it away for years." She reached into her pouch and pulled out the single folded bill. Her entire net worth. "I'll give you $20 for it," she said, laying it flat on his desk. It was a gamble of such monumental foolishness that it left him momentarily speechless. He looked from the bill to her face, a pale, determined oval framed by wind-tangled hair. He saw not a shrewd negotiator, but a desperate, half-mad girl. A flicker of something cunning and avaricious lit his eyes. He saw a solution. Not a profit, but a neat and tidy removal of his problem. If he sold it to her, the liability, the eyesore, it would become her problem. And a 17-year-old girl with no resources was a problem that was much easier to solve or to remove than a multi-ton steel wreck. He drew up a bill of sale on a scrap of paper, his pen scratching with finality. He wrote that for the sum of $20, the vessel known as the Sea Serpent, in its current as-is condition, was now the sole property and responsibility of Ilara Vance. "Sold," he said, snatching the $20 bill before she could have a second thought. "And I want it moved. You have until the first snow to get that blight off my view." The first snow. He said it with a finality that was both a deadline and a curse. In Port Blossom, the first snow could come as early as November, and it was always the harbinger of a winter that could kill. The deal was done. She walked out of the office, the flimsy piece of paper clutched in her hand, the new owner of a mountain of rust, with the laughter of the fishermen following her like a flock of gulls. She was no longer just homeless. She was the town fool. Her first inspection of her new property was a sobering affair. Up close, the decay was even more profound. The steel of the hull was pitted and scaled, whole sections flaking away like dead skin. The deck planks were soft with rot, and a small, tenacious ecosystem of moss and lichen had taken root in the damp corners. She climbed aboard, the structure groaning under her slight weight, and made her way to the hatch that led below deck. It was rusted shut. She needed a tool, a lever. This brought her to the one person in Port Blossom who might help her, not out of kindness, but out of a weary sense of obligation. Old Man Hemlock was the town's unofficial historian of hulls and heartaches. He had been a boatwright for 50 years, his hands gnarled and stained with the ghosts of 1,000 repairs. He had known her father well, had respected him, and now looked upon Alara with a deep, sorrowful pity that she found more galling than the town's open mockery. He worked in a cavernous shed that smelled of sawdust, Stockholm tar, and the slow passage of time. He was planing a piece of cedar when she appeared in the doorway, a silhouette against the glaring gray sky. "Hemlock," she said, her voice quiet. He stopped his work, wiping his brow with the back of his hand, leaving a smudge of wood dust. "I heard what you did, girl," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Bought Croft's rust pile. That was a fool's bargain if ever there was one." "I need to borrow a crowbar," she replied, ignoring the judgment. "The main hatch is seized." He sighed, a long, rattling exhalation of disappointment. "What are you even hoping to find down there? A family of rats and a foot of bilge water?" "It's not about what I'll find," she said. "It's about what I'm going to do." He shook his head, a slow, sad gesture. He walked to a cluttered wall of tools, his movements stiff with age, and pulled a long, heavy crowbar from its hooks. "Here," he grunted, handing it to her. "But you listen to me. There's no salvaging that wreck. Your father, he was a practical man. He'd tell you to stop chasing ghosts and find a warm place to sleep. I've got a cot in the back you can use for a few nights." The offer was kind, the first she'd had in weeks, but she refused it. "Thank you, Mr. Hemlock, but I have a place to sleep now." She hefted the crowbar, its weight a solid, reassuring thing in her hands, and walked back to the sea serpent. The old man watched her go, the scent of cedar and pity hanging in the air around him. He saw a girl clinging to a fantasy, a child trying to build a home out of a tomb. He did not see the blueprint that was slowly, painstakingly, being drawn in her mind. Back at the boat, she wedged the tip of the crowbar into the seam of the hatch. She put her entire weight into it, her muscles screaming in protest. The metal groaned, a high, mournful sound of resistance. For a long moment, nothing happened. The rust held its seal. The fisherman, still watching from a distance, started making comments. "She's going to break her back before she breaks that seal." Then, with a sudden violent crack that echoed across the flats, the rust gave way. The hatch shuddered open a few inches. She worked the crowbar around the edge, breaking the seal piece by piece, until finally she could heave the heavy steel plate open. A wave of cool, musty air washed over her, the smell of trapped darkness, of stagnant water and decay. It smelled of the deep, forgotten places of the earth. She peered down into the blackness. A ladder, its rungs slick with moisture, descended into the cavernous space below. She had no light, but she went anyway, her feet finding the rungs with cautious familiarity. She descended out of the wind and the gray light, into the belly of the beast. It was bigger than she had imagined. The hull, so broad on the outside, created a vast, cathedral-like space within. Ribs of steel, thick as a man's arm, curved upwards, disappearing into the gloom. The air was still and cold, a profound subterranean cold that was different from the biting wind above. It was a stable, unchanging cold, the cold of a cellar. A foot of murky, rust-colored water sloshed on the bottom, but the hull itself above the waterline seemed largely intact from the inside. The steel was thick here, protected from the elements. She ran her hand along the cold, curved wall. It was like touching the inside of a great iron cave. This was the heart of her idea. It was a memory, a piece of her father's wisdom surfacing from the depths of her grief. He had been talking about ice, about how the old fishing schooners before the days of refrigeration would pack their holds with ice harvested from winter ponds. He'd said that a well-insulated hull, buried deep in the earth, could keep ice frozen well into the summer. The earth, he'd explained, was a great insulator. A few feet down, the temperature barely changed, winter or summer. He called it the thermal constant. Most people saw a boat as something that floated on water. Her father had taught her to see it as a vessel, a container, a shell of expertly curved steel designed to hold something in and keep something else out. And Alara's plan was to keep the winter out. She would not raise the sea serpent. She would sink it. She would bury it in the mud and sand, turning its strong, deep hull into a foundation, a basement, a home. The deck would become her roof, the hatch her front door. It was an idea that inverted the very purpose of a boat, turning it from a symbol of movement and freedom into one of permanence and shelter. It was madness. It was brilliant. And it was the only chance she had. The work began the next day, with a shovel borrowed from Hemlock's seemingly endless collection of tools he was willing to lend to the town's madwoman. Her first task was to drain the bilge. She used a bucket and a rope, hauling up gallons of foul, stagnant water, her arms and back quickly beginning to ache with a deep, unfamiliar fire. It took her 2 full days of monotonous, back-breaking labor. The fishermen's mockery turned into a kind of grudging curiosity. They watched her toil, a small solitary figure engaged in a pointless, Herculean task. They didn't offer to help, but their laughter became less frequent. Once the water was gone, she was left with a thick layer of rust-colored sludge. She shoveled it into buckets, hauling them up the ladder and dumping them over the side. The work was filthy, exhausting, and utterly without glory. Every muscle screamed. Her hands, soft from weeks of inactivity, were soon raw and blistered. She wrapped them in strips of cloth torn from her own shirt and kept digging. She was not just clearing out a space, she was claiming it, baptizing it with her own sweat and effort. Then came the digging. This was the true heart of the project. She had to excavate the earth around and under the great hull, allowing it to settle deeper into the ground. The boat was already partially sunk into the mudflats, but she needed it to go deeper, until the deck was nearly level with the surrounding ground. She started on the port side, the side that was already lowest. The ground was a mix of sand, clay, and stone, a stubborn, unyielding medium. Each shovelful was a victory. She worked from dawn until dusk, fueled by a cold, hard resolve, and the stale bread she bought with the few coins she earned doing odd jobs around the cannery. Mr. Croft watched her progress from the window of his office, his displeasure growing with every inch she dug. He had expected her to give up after a day, to be broken by the sheer futility of the task. Instead, she was digging in, literally. She was turning his eyesore into a semi-permanent fixture. He confronted her one afternoon, striding across the flats, his polished shoes sinking into the mud. "What in God's name do you think you're doing, girl?" he demanded. "You're making a pigsty. This is private property." "It's my private property," she replied, not pausing in her digging, her voice tight with exertion. "I bought the boat. You're creating a hazard." "A public nuisance," he sputtered. "That hole will fill with water. It'll be a breeding ground for mosquitoes." "I'm making a home," she said simply, finally stopping to look at him. Her face was smudged with dirt, her hair matted with sweat, but her eyes were clear and steady. The statement was so absurd, so completely at odds with the scene of industrial squalor around them, that it left him speechless once more. He saw then that logic and threats would not work. This was not a rational actor he was dealing with. This was a stray dog building a nest. He stormed off, muttering about town ordinances and health codes. The war had escalated. A week into her digging, Hemlock paid her a visit. He brought her a thermos of hot coffee and a small wrapped sandwich. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, watching her work, his old eyes taking in the trench she had carved alongside the hull. It was nearly 4 feet deep now. "You're going to kill yourself," he said finally. "This is no work for a slip of a girl." She accepted the coffee, the warmth of the thermos a small miracle against the growing autumn chill. "It's got to be done," she said, "before the snow." He shook his head. "Alara, listen. Croft is stirring up trouble. He's talking to the council. He's going to have you and that boat removed. You can't fight him." "I'm not fighting him," she said. "I'm digging a hole." Hemlock looked from her determined face to the immense rusted hull. He saw the blisters on her hands, the exhaustion etched around her eyes. And for the first time, his pity was joined by a flicker of something else. It wasn't belief, not yet, but it was a kind of grudging respect for her sheer mule-headed stubbornness. A stubbornness that reminded him, uncomfortably, of her father. "You're doing it all wrong," he grumbled, pointing with the stem of his pipe. "You're just piling the dirt up. A good rain will wash it all right back in. You need to move it, and you'll never get the hull to settle evenly with just a shovel. You need leverage. You need a plan." It was the first time anyone had spoken of her project as if it were a real thing, a problem of engineering rather than a symptom of madness. A crack had appeared in the wall of her isolation. Over the next few weeks, Hemlock became a reluctant consultant. He never admitted to believing in her vision, framing all his advice in skeptical, practical terms. He showed her how to use a wheelbarrow to move the excavated earth further away, building it into a berm that would act as a windbreak and a barrier against surface water. He brought her a set of old heavy-duty jacks, the kind used to lift engines out of boats. "This is just so you don't get yourself crushed," he'd muttered, refusing to meet her eye. With the jacks, the work changed. It became a slow, methodical process of digging, jacking, and settling. She would excavate a section under the keel, then use the jacks to support the weight, remove more earth, and then slowly, carefully, release the pressure, allowing the massive hull to sink a few precious inches. It was dangerous, terrifying work. A slip of the jack, a miscalculation, and the tons of steel above her would crush her instantly. She worked with a focus that was absolute, a state of pure concentration where there was room for nothing but the task at hand. The groan of the metal, the feel of the soil, the delicate balance of immense forces. The town watched this new phase with a mixture of awe and morbid anticipation. The rumor mill churned. The fisherman's girl was trying to bury her own coffin. She was a mole woman, gone mad from grief. Croft, meanwhile, was making good on his threats. He had the town's health inspector come down, a weaselly man who declared the site unsafe. He posted notices of violation on the hull. Alara simply took them down and used them as kindling for the small fires she built at night to warm her hands and cook the meager fish she caught off the end of the pier. Croft was apoplectic. He had underestimated her resilience, her utter indifference to his authority. He saw her not as a child to be pitied, but as a challenge, an insurrection of one. By mid-October, the Sea Serpent had sunk nearly 6 feet into the earth. The top of its deck was now only a few feet above the ground. The berm of excavated earth surrounded it on 3 sides, creating a sheltered hollow. The transformation was startling. What had been a beached, listing wreck was now a solid, grounded structure, a part of the landscape. It looked less like a boat and more like an ancient iron-roofed hillock. Now the work moved inside. She had to make the cavernous hull livable. Hemlock, his skepticism now almost entirely eroded and replaced by a quiet proprietary pride, became her chief supplier. He brought her salvaged wood for flooring, sheets of tin for patching the deck from below, and a small pot-bellied stove that he claimed was just taking up space. He showed her how to build a frame for a floor above the curved bottom of the hull, creating a level living space and a crawl space for storage underneath. He helped her rig a ventilation pipe through an old porthole and a chimney for the stove, through a hole they carefully cut in the deck. She insulated the interior walls, the inside of the hull, with anything she could find. Salvaged cork from old life preservers, thick bundles of dried seaweed packed behind wooden framing, old sails and tarps. The principle was the same one her father had taught her. Trap the air. Create layers. The steel hull, the insulation, and finally the great thick blanket of the earth itself. It was a triple-layered defense against the coming cold. As she worked, she discovered things. Tucked away in a rusted locker, she found the boat's original logbook, wrapped in oilcloth. Its pages were stiff with age, but the ink was still legible. She read about the sea serpent's life. Decades of hauling cod and haddock from the Grand Banks. Surviving storms that had sent other, prouder boats to the bottom. She read the captain's notes about the boat's peculiar stability, how it was built like a bottle, low and wide, impossible to tip. The boat had a soul after all. It was a survivor. Like her. The first hint of winter arrived on a Tuesday in early November. Not snow, but a cold, driving rain that turned the world to a gray slurry. It was the kind of rain that soaked through the thickest wool, a bone-chilling deluge that promised worse to come. Croft saw his chance. He stood on the porch of his waterfront office, a smug smile on his face, watching the trench around her boat fill with water. He expected her to be flooded out, a drowned rat in her own failed experiment. But Hemlock had taught her about drainage. Weeks before, they had dug a deep sump pit at the lowest point of her excavation and laid a simple French drain, a gravel-filled trench, leading away from the hull to a lower part of the flats. As Croft watched, expecting disaster, the water level around the hull rose a few inches, then stabilized, the excess flowing harmlessly away through the drain he couldn't see. Alara, watching from her hatchway, saw the moment his triumphant smirk dissolved into frustrated confusion. It was a small victory, but it was sweet. The town was buzzing. The story of the girl who had buried a boat was no longer just a tale of madness, but one of inexplicable success. Fishermen would wander over, ostensibly to inspect the weather-beaten hull, but really to peer down into the cozy, lamp-lit space they could glimpse through the open hatch. They saw a clean, dry floor, a small stove puffing out gentle smoke, and the girl reading a book by its warmth. It defied all their expectations. It defied the laws of their world, where the sea and the damp were constant, invading enemies. Then the forecast came. It wasn't just a storm, it was a monster. A nor'easter of historic proportions, a perfect storm born of a confluence of weather systems, was churning up the coast. It was predicted to make landfall directly over Port Blossom, bringing with it hurricane-force winds and a storm surge that could raise the sea level by 15 feet. The town began to panic. Evacuation orders were issued for the entire waterfront. Boats were hauled out of the water or secured with lines as thick as a man's arm. Boarding up windows became the frantic percussion of the day. Hemlock came to her, his face gray with worry. "Alara, you have to leave," he pleaded. "This isn't a game. This storm will wash everything away. It will pick this hull up and toss it like a cork." She was calm, methodically checking the seals on her hatch and portholes. "It won't," she said. "It's not in the water, it's in the earth. The earth will hold it." He grabbed her arm, his desperation making him rough. "That's madness. The surge will come over the berm. You'll be trapped. You'll drown down there." "I'll be safe," she said, her voice filled with a certainty that unnerved him. "This is what I built it for. Mr. Hemlock, you should go. Get to high ground." He argued for another 10 minutes, his voice cracking with fear for her, before finally giving up. He looked at her one last time, a small, stubborn figure silhouetted in the hatchway of her strange, subterranean home. He thought it was the last time he would ever see her alive. Croft was one of the last to evacuate his waterfront properties. He saw her, a lone figure on the deck of her half-buried boat, securing the final hatch. He laughed, a bitter, triumphant sound carried on the rising wind. He shouted at her, his words torn away by the gale, but his meaning was clear. The sea would be his final judgment. It would scour the land clean of her and her rusty folly. Then the storm hit. Alara was below deck, in her small, warm cavern. The pot-bellied stove was filled, its gentle heat pushing back against the subterranean chill. A single kerosene lamp cast a steady, golden glow on the pages of the sea serpent's logbook. The world outside ceased to exist, replaced by sound. First came the wind, a low moan that grew into a deafening, unholy shriek. She could hear it screaming over the small opening of her chimney pipe. The entire hull, grounded as it was, seemed to vibrate with the sheer force of it, a deep thrumming that she felt in her bones. Then came the water. She didn't see it, but she heard it. A low, powerful roar that grew louder and louder until it was a thunderous cannonade against the world above. She heard the crash of waves, not against the hull, but on the ground over her head. She heard the sickening crunch of lesser structures giving way, the splintering of wood, the shriek of tortured metal. Debris carried by the surge scraped and banged against her deck and hatch, the sounds muffled by the layers of earth and steel. The air pressure in her small space changed, making her ears pop. Outside it was chaos and destruction. Inside, the lamp flame barely flickered. The stove radiated its steady warmth. She was safe. She was cocooned in the belly of the beast, held fast by the earth, while the ocean raged in a fury just feet above her head. She felt no fear, only a profound sense of rightness. Her father's wisdom, her own back-breaking labor, it had all led to this. A quiet, warm, and utterly safe place in the heart of a maelstrom. The storm raged for 8 hours. When the sounds of the wind and water finally began to recede, replaced by an eerie silence, she fell into a deep, exhausted sleep. She awoke to the sound of shouting. It was faint at first, then closer. She unsealed her main hatch, pushing it open against a weight of debris. The morning light was pale and watery, illuminating a scene of utter devastation. The waterfront was gone. Docks were splintered into kindling. Sheds were obliterated. Boats had been tossed onto the shore like bath toys. Croft's waterfront office had been gutted, its walls blown out, its contents strewn across the mudflats. And standing there, knee-deep in the wreckage, were Hemlock and Croft. They were staring at her, or rather at the small plume of smoke rising cheerfully from her chimney pipe, which poked up from a small island of debris-strewn ground that had been her deck. They looked like men who had seen a ghost. Hemlock's workshop was flooded, his tools scattered, but he was alive. Croft's face was a mask of disbelief and ruin. He had lost everything. Hemlock was the first to move, sloshing through the water toward her. He stopped at the edge of her berm, his eyes wide. "How?" he breathed, the word a cloud of vapor in the cold air. It was a question that held all the skepticism, all the mockery, all the pity he had ever felt for her, now transformed into pure, unadulterated awe. She looked at him from her hatchway, her face calm, and simply said, "The earth held." The deal was done. The storm had been the final, undeniable test. She had been right. In the weeks that followed, the story of the girl who survived the great storm in a buried boat became a local legend. The community's perception of her shifted with the force of a tidal change. She was no longer the fisherman's girl or the town fool. They called her the hull wife, the groundkeeper. The mockery was replaced by a quiet, profound respect. The same fishermen who had laughed at her now came to her, hats in hand, asking how she had done it. They brought her supplies, food, and offers of help. They looked at the ruins of their own vulnerable, shore-built homes, and then at her solid, earth-sheltered refuge, and they finally understood. Croft was ruined, both financially and socially. His arrogance had been washed away by the storm surge, leaving behind a bitter, humbled man who could not bear to look at the rusty boat that had weathered the storm better than his own ambitions. He sold his properties for pennies on the dollar and left town within the year. Hemlock, however, became her greatest champion. He helped her make improvements to her home, bringing his boatwright skills to bear on the interior, crafting beautiful, clever storage spaces and furniture. He became the grandfather she had never had. his workshop her second home. Her idea, born of desperation and an old fisherman's wisdom, began to spread. People in Port Blossom, and soon in other coastal towns, began to look at the boat boneyards not as graveyards, but as quarries. They started building their own hull homes, sinking the strong, discarded shells of old vessels into the earth to create storm-proof, energy-efficient dwellings. Alara, the girl who had owned nothing, found herself the respected founder of a new school of architecture, an innovator who had taught a town how to find strength in what they had thrown away. She never grew rich, but she was never cold or hungry again. She lived out her days in the belly of the sea serpent, a quiet, respected woman who had built her fortress not of stone or wood, but of rust, earth, and a radical idea. Decades later, when another great storm would threaten the coast, the people of Port Blossom would not evacuate. They would simply batten down the hatches of their strange, sturdy homes and listen to the wind howl overhead, safe in the knowledge that the most enduring shelters are not those that fight the storm, but those that have learned the wisdom of letting the earth hold them fast. The legacy of the homeless girl and her $20 boat was not just a new way of building. It was a new way of seeing. It was a lesson written in steel and soil that true value is often hidden beneath a surface of neglect, and that the most powerful innovations often come from those who have nothing left to lose, and therefore have the freedom to see everything to gain.